Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Hermeneutics of Jewish Political Thought with Christine Hayes. This learning session is part of a 2-week symposium entitled Judaism, Citizenship, and Democracy from the Shalom Hartman Institute. We are a pluralistic think tank and educational center for the Jewish people. You can find out more about us and see more of our videos, articles, and podcasts at shalomhartman.org. My name is Michael Grumer. I'll be helping to facilitate this session from behind the scenes. We're ready to begin. I'm happy to hand it over to Christine Hayes.
Thank you for that welcome, Michael. I'm excited to be meeting with everyone today. And as Michael noted, the topic of this webinar is the hermeneutics of Jewish politics. And I'd actually like to begin with a story that I think lays bare what is at stake when we bring contemporary questions to traditional texts. I'm going to invest a good 10 minutes in this story because it exposes the difference between the historian and the philosopher, which are not pure types, I think, found in the world anywhere. But it's relevant for answering 4 questions that will be my focus today. What, how, who, and why? What are we doing when we read ancient texts from a contemporary perspective? Are we seeking understanding? And if so, an understanding of the texts, of ourselves, some combination of the two? Or are we seeking validation, again, of the text through a kind of rescue that shows its relevance, or a validation of ourselves by invoking a text with authority or authenticity? The second question after the what we're doing is how. How do we responsibly and ethically undertake to read traditional texts with contemporary questions in mind? And the third question is who? Who do we think is entitled to participate in this activity? And I pose that question both about the authors whose texts are included in the tradition and the readers who are interpreting and interrogating those traditional texts. But the fourth and most fundamental question is why? Why should we even look at traditional texts when debating contemporary issues? But first, the story. So in 2015, I published a book called What's Divine? About Divine Law. And in it, I described the explosive confrontation of 2 radically divergent conceptions of divine law, the biblical conception and the Greek conception. And I argued and showed that the biblical tradition conceives of divine law as a set of divinely authored laws and commandments, expressing the will of the divine sovereign, given by him to a particular historical community living in a particular place. This law is not universal. It contains some commandments that are not deducible by reason, precisely to distinguish the Israelites from other peoples. And like the best written laws of any community, it's flexible and mutable. It changes and grows in response to new, unanticipated circumstances already in Moses' time on at least 4 occasions. But in the 3rd century, before the Common Era, with the Hellenization of the East, Jews encountered a very different conception of divine law, deriving from the Greek philosophical tradition, particularly the Stoics. Now, the Stoics came up with the then novel idea of an unwritten rational order or logos embedded in nature, governing the cosmos and serving as a source of morality. Because they believed that nature and God were one and the same thing, this impersonal natural law was divine law. So for the Stoics, the divine or natural law was not a set of written rules or laws given by a deity to a particular community, but logos, reason itself, universal, eternal, unchanging, and true. Written laws and rules that govern particular communities and are changeable and coercively enforced and not always inherently rational are not divine. They're by definition human. Well, the incongruity between the biblical conception of divine law, a divinely authored set of laws, and the Greek idea of divine law, a transcendent reason that's the source of moral virtue, was obvious and troubling to ancient Jews, and they responded to this cognitive dissonance in various ways. Some, like Philo of Alexandria, who embraced the Greek definition of divine law, were on the defensive, understanding that to the Greeks, the Torah of Moses had all the earmarks of human legislation. Philo asserted that the law of Moses actually possessed all the traits of divine law as defined by the Stoic tradition. This required real inventiveness and a great deal of allegorical interpretation on his part, but he was determined to prove that the Mosaic law was the immutable, true logos, universal, and that it qualified as divine law on the Stoic definition. The rabbis distinguished themselves from other ancient Jewish groups by knowingly and defiantly advancing a portrait of the Mosaic law as divine, but without necessarily being utterly rational, true, or immutable, or universal. I show that some rabbinic sources take aim at the Stoic definition of divine law itself, rejecting or mocking the very idea of a universal logos or reason embedded in nature, accessible to the sage, and the grounding source of an absolute and immutable universal morality. I note explicitly that following the close of the Talmud, Jewish philosophers attracted to the Greek idea of natural law and a rationally accessible and immutable morality worked very hard to locate that idea in the classical Jewish sources, in the Talmud, converting the so-called Noahide laws into a Jewish version of a natural law. But in the early rabbinic sources on this topic, the laws given to Noah and his descendants are an intentional inversion of the idea of natural law. As we see in the first source in your book, but in your handout, but I'm not going to be looking at it carefully. This is part of a story. It's okay if you're not following these details, and you're welcome to read source number 1 after the webinar. I'll simply describe it here. It lists a set of laws imposed by God on Noah and his descendants after the flood. The rabbis here dispute not only the number of these laws, but also their specific content. Now, for the Stoics, natural law is never legislation in the form of rules and commandments imposed by a lawgiver, divine or not. It is just reason itself. Moreover, the Noahide laws in this passage do not apply universally and uniformly to all humans. The laws of robbery, murder, and even sexual prohibitions apply differently to Jews and to non-Jews. Medieval and modern Jewish philosophers say that's because the Noahide laws are sort of bottom line morality to which the Torah then adds additional stringencies for Jews. In the medieval period, but not in this text, some of these rules don't apply to Jews at all, or they apply more leniently. There's more to say, but suffice it for now to say that from a purely historical perspective, the question of whether this text depicts a natural law on the Stoic model can be safely answered in the negative, or perhaps not so safely, as I was recently challenged for my assertion that the rabbis construct the Noahide laws as a way of undermining the idea of a universal natural law identical with and accessible to reason. Now, my critic is a philosopher and a theologian of Judaism, and he insists, I'm going to share my screen here, so hopefully those of you with a video can see, he insists that a natural law theory using a variety of different terms for itself throughout the ages has been a constant element in Jewish thought. Now, he offers no counter reading of the particular passage on the Noahide laws that's in source 1. He simply points to a few typical biblical verses and rabbinic passages that medieval thinkers later decontextualized and reworked and reinterpreted to construct a Jewish natural law theory. But in their own context and time and idiom, these sources convey nothing of the sort. In the Talmudic texts about the Noahide laws, the source of morality is not an impersonal reason, but a divine will expressed in commandments that, unlike natural law, are not rationally accessed or universal or even immutable, but particular, historically contingent, dynamic, and imposed from the outside by a divine lawgiver. So what lies at the heart of these very different interpretations of the tradition? And this is the point of my story. For my critic, the question of natural law in Judaism is first and foremost a philosophical and theological question crucial to the activity of constructing the best version of Judaism. And for that, getting the history exactly right isn't terribly important. What matters is the truth beyond history. Very much like Philo, my critic believes that natural law and absolute morality are truths beyond history, and that's absolutely his right. But because he holds that Jewish tradition is truth too, it's incumbent on him to demonstrate that natural law is not only consistent with, but taught in the earliest sources of the tradition. My denial of that claim exercises him greatly. And in a section called The Reason for Writing, he explains that he has written his response to my book because, on the screen now, because a theoretical affirmation of natural law as endemic to Judaism saves the normative Jewish tradition. I want to repeat that, saves the normative Jewish tradition from being seen by its own adherents as sub-rational or irrational rather than super-rational or trans-rational. Well, I would argue that an absolutist faith in rationalism is not the unmitigated good that my critic believes it is, which is why I don't think I've harmed Judaism or insulted the rabbis by pointing out that they reject the Stoic deification of reason as idolatry, as my critics would have it. Understandably sensitive to Enlightenment critiques of Judaism as a sub-rational or an irrational parochial legalism, he feels a duty to prove Judaism's fundamental and original embrace of natural law. So he describes the difference between our work and our approaches this way. He says, as a philosopher, I have to say what I think is true, whereas an historian like Hayes is only responsible for accurately saying what they, I guess the Talmudic rabbis, thought is true. Well, my critic is right that in my book, the question of natural law in Judaism is, for me, first and foremost, a historical question. I labor intensively to reconstruct as fairly and truthfully and honestly as I can on the basis of an exhaustive array of sources rather than a cherry-picked few, an accurate history of the rise and the fall and the revivals and the eclipses and the complex interactions of competing ideas that continue to animate the present Jewish moment. But to say that my approach is first and foremost historical doesn't mean that my goals are solely record-keeping or archival. I believe passionately that we need this kind of careful and honest understanding of how and why certain ideas came into being and how and why they became the inheritance of contemporary Judaism and indeed the contemporary West, if we are to assess their merit and evaluate our options and ultimately gain some measure of intentionality and control when it comes to shaping the next chapter in this continuing story. So it's with these thoughts in mind that I turn to the question of engaging with traditional Jewish texts when considering contemporary political questions. How do we do this ethically, responsibly? An outstanding exemplar of this approach is the ongoing series, a series of volumes in the Jewish political tradition. This is a series of books edited by Michael Walzer and an illustrious company. And in the introduction to the first volume, Walzer provides transparent answers to the 4 questions that I posed at the outset. I'd like to review the basic contours of the project, consider some criticisms that have been leveled at it, think about how those criticisms might be met by working with you through a case study, and then conclude by returning to the 4 questions posed earlier, especially the question, why do we even look at traditional texts when considering contemporary questions? Now, the editors of the Jewish political tradition reject the once prevalent idea that in the absence of a Jewish state, Jews did not engage in political activity or reflection, and that consequently there is no Jewish political tradition in the 2 millennia intervening between the Second Commonwealth and the foundation of the State of Israel. The 4 volumes present and analyze texts that speak to this tradition of Jewish political thought. The introduction to volume 1, and I'm going to share my screen again, sets forth the editor's threefold purpose, which is as follows. Retrieval. Retrieval refers to the goal of making the central texts and arguments available to new generations of students and potential participants. The words potential participants are important. These words signal that for the editors, the Jewish political tradition is not just a past to be studied, but a present and future to be continued by new participants. Their second purpose is integration. This is explained by the editors as taking this body of Jewish thought out of its intellectual ghetto to begin to examine the ways in which it follows, parallels, and strains against Greek, Arabic, Christian, and secularist modes of thought. So far, so good. But I'm particularly interested in the editor's third stated purpose, which is criticism, which is explained as the desire to attempt to join the arguments that have characterized the tradition and to carry them forward, or better, to argue among ourselves and to encourage others to argue about which of them can usefully be carried forward under the modern conditions of emancipation and sovereignty. So to answer the question, what does this series of volumes in the Jewish political tradition propose to do with classical texts? Well, at the most basic level, this series seeks to retrieve a Jewish political tradition. And why are they doing this? The purpose is not merely archival, record keeping. The purpose of these volumes is to curate a usable past, a tradition that through analysis and critique can serve as a resource for meeting the challenges of the political moment. And in truth, this is the most human of activities. We are interpreting and narrating animals. We're hardwired to make sense of the events of yesterday in order to prepare for and better meet the challenges of today and tomorrow. We don't experience our lives as a set of disconnected episodes. We automatically interpret, evaluate, and organize events into a narrative that helps us make sense of the past and make choices for the future. The virtue of the Jewish Political Tradition series is that it proposes that we undertake this hardwired, automatic human activity intentionally. Let us intentionally and actively retrieve a set of texts and ideas that share a commitment to a common Jewish conversation. Integrate those texts and ideas with thematically related texts and ideas from other cultures, so as to probe their fullest meanings and implications. And then finally, once we have them fully available and fully legible, subject them to an evaluation, a critique, to discern which of yesterday's ideas might be of greatest use today and tomorrow. So much for what and why. Now on to how. The editors state openly that while they strive to be historically sensitive, they labor in the field of political theory, not history. They acknowledge that the texts collected in these volumes were written by figures who lived in particular historical times and places and were involved in local political struggles and intellectual debates. But a detailed consideration of such issues, they say, is the province of the historian, and readers interested in them should consult one of the standard histories. Not unimportant, but not what we're doing. The focus in these volumes is on the way various writers, while referring continually to the classical writings of the tradition, have addressed larger recurrent issues and engaged in arguments about reiterated political and intellectual challenges. This is the province of the political theorist, whose overriding question is, how should we engage with and carry on this tradition of thought? What in it needs to be criticized or revised or abandoned? And finally, the question of who participates. The editors focus on legal commentaries and codes and responsa, and they acknowledge the fact that in so doing, their volume represents only one part of the tradition, though in their view, it's the dominant part. Their principle of selection is clear. What marks the works that they've assembled in this series as a tradition is their intertextuality, by which the editors mean the writer's habit of referring to a common set of authoritative texts and critical events. To put things a bit more bluntly, a text is not a part of the Jewish political tradition merely because its author is a Jew, even a Jew writing about politics. So there's no Marx or Freud or Durkheim in these volumes. By contrast, Spinoza is included, and because the Hebrew Bible is his first text, and Maimonides is a crucial reference for him. Secular writers like Achad Ha'am and Berdichevsky are also included because they worked within the tradition, even if they did so in order to mount an anti-traditionalist critique. In other words, the tradition is defined as a kind of textscape whose authors are not required to pass a religious litmus test, but who demonstrate through their textual and intellectual habits that they are committed to the conversation and its ground rules of reference. As for who can participate in the analysis and commentary and continuation of the tradition, here again, the authors are explicit. I'll share my screen again. These commentaries, they say, are written by contemporary political and social theorists and moral philosophers, and by scholars in Jewish studies with related interests who were asked to join the arguments of the texts, not simply to describe or contextualize them, but to really argue with them. They do this in their own historical or analytical fashion. The point of the commentaries, however, is not history or analysis, but rather engagement with a set of issues. We want to display the tradition as a continuing argument. Two forms of commentary, however, are not represented here: the pious apologetic and the scholarly detached. Writing a commentary is an active engagement, and this commonly is and always should be a critical, not apologetic, engagement, an effort to get or set things right. So they've answered the four questions posed at the beginning. They have answered the what and the why questions by delineating their threefold purpose of retrieval, integration, and criticism in order to yield a usable past, a past whose most useful elements can be evaluated and carried forward. They have told us how they will proceed as political theorists rather than as historians, although historically sensitive. They've told us who is involved, whose writings are being read, those who refer to the same basic set of authoritative texts and critical events, and who is doing the work of retrieving, integrating, and critiquing the texts. Persons engaged with the tradition, but to just the right degree, not under-engaged like scholars of the stereotype who work in a dispassionate way, and not over-engaged like pious apologists determined to locate their personal convictions in the tradition, like my critic in the opening story, and willing to substitute their own voice for the voice of the text if necessary. Well, in a recent review of the third volume in the series, Elisheva Karlbach, and the title of her review is here, offers important criticisms, three of which are relevant to our concerns today. First, she casts doubt on the viability of the project's aspiration to retrieve something that can be usefully carried forward. She writes, trying to retrieve models from the past with a decidedly contemporary purpose makes it difficult to see what those past models were, how to interpret them, and even where to look for them. In other words, she raises the important question of whether usefulness as a principle of selection is automatically distorting and limiting. Does a search for what can usefully be carried forward blind the editors to material that on the face of it does not appear to be relevant or useful, but might be? Does an implicit teleological focus, right, a focus on the linear development of the tradition, lead them to ignore material that they prejudge as having no contemporary utility, or cause them to miss the byways and the false starts once discarded, but perhaps ripe for renewal? Elisheva Karlbach points to a second problem, that insufficient attention to the historical context and debates that generated the texts included in the volume can be a problem. Now, the editors acknowledge that they are working as political theorists and not historians, to be fair. But Karlbach maintains that an ahistorical approach is inherently flawed without an appreciation of the historical circumstances of these text production. Then texts that were created in response to specific situations and political contexts risk being misread. Now, the misreading that worries Karlbach is not only a misreading of the text content, although taking a text out of context inevitably risks a violation of its true meaning. The misreading that worries Karlbach is a misreading of the text genre. She writes, texts that were originally contingent, dialectical, interpretive, or narrative appear alongside apodictic and authoritative pronouncements, joined together in one comprehensive tradition, creating what is almost a new scripture on Jewish politics. Our current moment has sensitized all of us as never before to the political and moral harm that is done when a speaker's words are taken out of context and recontextualized, whether in order to discredit the speaker or conversely to co-opt the speaker's authority so as to lend credence to a position the speaker actually opposes, as happened recently with Dr. Anthony Fauci. I want to avoid for now larger debates about whether the object of interpretation is the meaning intended by the author, and even if it is, whether we can ever truly access it, or whether texts have meanings distinct from and in excess of those intended by the author. These are important and legitimate questions, but I want to bracket them in order to focus not on the difficulty of the task, but on the moral desirability of the task. We know it's wrong to interpret the words of living persons in a manner that violates their meaning. We have all felt frustration at having our words be misconstrued, and anger if it is done willfully. Is it any less wrong to misconstrue the words of dead people, a failing that is more likely if we have stripped their words from their original context? A third problem underscored by Karlbach is the volume's presentation of a Jewish political tradition that's based on elite texts rather than the lived experience of Jewish communities, attested in many and various kinds of evidence, documents from the Cairo Geniza, thousands of records of bylaws and institutions found in the Pinkasim, the notebooks and record books of early modern Jewish communities, Kehilot. These are but a couple of examples. The presence of these materials would naturally complicate what can otherwise appear to be a rather continuous, steady tradition. Well, these criticisms are important and they can't be ignored. The question is, how do we engage texts of the Jewish tradition as full partners in a contemporary conversation while avoiding the pitfalls outlined by Karlbach? It seems to me that at a minimum, we need to do the following. We need to ensure that our principle of selection doesn't cherry pick the evidence and prejudge the outcomes. We need to give due attention to the historical circumstance of any text production and its genre, so that contingent and dialectical and interpretive and narrative texts don't take on the air of unimpeachable authority. We need to expand the scope of the tradition where possible to include not only elite texts, but alternative voices and cultural expressions. And we need to resist the temptation to see value only in that which leads to us or most resembles our own convictions, and be alive to the unexpected, the unfamiliar, the non-linear, in short, the multiple diverging trajectories making up this vast and variegated tradition. So I want to take now a well-studied example from the realm of politics to show how a historically informed and contextual reading of texts dealing with the separation of powers and an independent judiciary might proceed ethically while still contributing usefully to contemporary political debates and even the continuation of the tradition itself. So again, I'm going to share my screen to look at Mishnah Sanhedrin 2:2. Now, if you have your source sheet instead, you'll find that this is in text 4. So when we're looking at Mishnah 2, paragraph 2 from Tractates Sanhedrin, it's in your text 4. And it contains the following remarkable statement about the king. The king can neither judge nor be judged. He cannot testify, and others cannot testify against him. So this text asserts that the king stands outside the law, not necessarily under the law or above the law, but simply outside the law. He cannot be judged for misdeeds, but at the same time, he cannot wield power in judgment against others for personal or political ends. He cannot be testified against, but then neither can he testify against others. Now, the Babylonian Talmud, which is now text 6, if you're looking at your source sheet, but I'll put it up here in a moment, contains the following comment that immediately undercuts this passage. We read in the Gemara that Rabbi Yosef said, this refers only to the kings of the northern kingdom of Israel, the 10 tribes in the northern kingdom of Israel that was destroyed in 722 by the Assyrians. But the kings of the house of David in Judah, the southern kingdom, may judge and be judged. And then he gives a proof text, one from Jeremiah showing that the house of David executes justice. And if they may not be judged, how could they judge? So if they execute justice, then they must also be judged. Now, as Michael Walzer points out in his commentary on these two texts specifically in volume 1 of the series of the Jewish political tradition, the Babylonian Talmud significantly qualifies or limits the scope and the impact of the dictum in the Mishnah, limiting it to the kings of Israel alone, the northern kingdom that was destroyed in 722, and not the kings of the house of David who ruled in the southern kingdom of Judah. In other words, the Mishnah's separation of the executive and the judiciary is understood by the Talmud to be the exception rather than the rule. The rule, according to the Talmud, is that normally kings do, in fact, participate in the judiciary, and they are subject to its jurisdiction. The Talmud then explains the Mishnah's now exceptional exclusion of the king from the judiciary by relating the specific incident that led the Mishnah to say what it says, right? Why do they say a king can neither judge nor be judged, when in fact they can? Why did they say that? And here's the story. And it's in the same source. But why this prohibition of the kings of Israel, that they can neither judge nor be judged? Because of an incident which happened with a slave of the Hasmonean king Yanai, who killed a man. Shimon ben Shetach, who was the chief judge, head of the Sanhedrin, said to the sages, "Set your eyes boldly upon him and let us judge him." So they sent the king word saying, "Your slave has killed a man." Thereupon he sent him, the slave, to them to be tried. But they again sent him a message and said, "No, you too must come here, for the Torah says, if warning has been given to its owners," in Exodus 21:29, teaching that the owner of the ox must come and stand by his ox, and similarly a slave who is also the master's chattel needs to come and stand in the judgment. So the king accordingly came and he sat down. And then Shimon ben Shetach said, "Stand on your feet, King Yanai, you're in the court, and let the witnesses testify against you. Yet it is not before us that you stand, but before him who spoke and the world came into being, as it is written, and then both the men between whom the controversy is shall stand." He answered, "I shall not act in accordance with what you say, but in accordance with whatever your colleagues say." Well, Shimon then turned first to the right, and they, his colleagues, for the fear of the king, looked down at the ground. And then he looked to the left, and they looked down to the ground. And then Shimon ben Shetach said to them, "Oh, deep in thought, are you? Let the master of thoughts, God, come and call you to account." And instantly Gabriel came and struck them to the ground, and they died. It was there and then enacted that a king may neither judge nor be judged, testify nor be testified against. So the assertion of royal privilege by King Yanai, a non-Davidic Hasmonean king, has deadly results for the court. And to avoid future confrontations, it was decided that non-Davidic kings who do not respect the law and bully the court just may not be judged, which may seem like a reward of sovereign immunity for bad behavior. But since a person who is not subject to the jurisdiction of the court also cannot enjoy the privileges of judging, the king gives up the right to judge or to pursue his enemies through the courts. But the separation of judiciary and executive functions is not the rule, according to the Talmud, not the rule for good and pious kings like David, just the exception. Now, Michael Walzer's commentary takes these texts as the starting point for an exploration of the separation of powers. And focusing on the Babylonian Talmud's interpretation of the Mishnah that we've just reviewed, Walzer is led to the quite reasonable conclusion that the removal of the king from the judiciary is a surrender to royal power that signals a failure to incorporate kingship within a constitutional structure. That's the Mishnah's model, excuse me. The Talmud's ideal model has the king ruling alongside and also with and through a high court, the Sanhedrin, participating in the work of the court and subject to its judgments, but only if he chooses to do so. More important, the story in the Babylonian Talmud suggests that the ideal structure, the Talmud's ideal structure of a coordinated judiciary and executive, simply collapses when challenged by a less than ideal king, a bully. So, on the one hand, the story in the Babylonian Talmud reverses the Mishnah's dictum that a king neither judges nor is judged. Ideally, the king is within the jurisdiction of the judiciary. But on the other hand, it concedes that in the case of a showdown, the king wins. There's no effective limit on monarchic power, no independent actors capable of controlling a rogue king, creating a default and dangerous sovereign immunity. Well, this is an entirely plausible and very powerful read of the Mishnah, Sanhedrin 2:2, through the lens of the passage in the Babylonian Talmud. But as Walzer and his fellow editors are the first to admit, it's only the beginning. So how might we proceed from here? Mindful of Karlbach's admonitions, we can proceed by both broadening and deepening our investigation. What is the broader literary context of that dictum in the Mishnah? That dictum appears within a larger chapter, within a tractate, within the Mishnah as a whole, which is one of several contemporaneous collections of rabbinic teachings that include the Tosefta and various midrashim, that themselves stand within an even broader set of Jewish writings beyond the normative rabbinic tradition, the writings of Philo and Josephus and the Qumran sectarians. So how are we to read this brief dictum in these expanding contexts? Is it a majority view, a minority view? Does it turn out to be an accepted view, a contested view? Are there alternative views? There is also, of course, the question of the Mishnah's historical context. How does that deepen our understanding? Well, fortunately, I didn't have to do all this work. One scholar has already taken up the invitation to continue the labor just begun by Walzer and his other editors. In his article, The King and I, David Flato considers contemporary questions of the separation of powers, judicial independence, and sovereign immunity in the American system in light of Mishnah Sanhedrin 2:2 and related teachings. But instead of reading the Mishnah through the lens of the Babylonian Talmud, which radically reverses its meaning, he examines the Mishnah in a series of expanding contexts. And the payoff is the emergence into view of alternative visions of the separation of powers that are obscured when we trace only a linear development from the Mishnah through the Talmud. And this highlights the intentional choices made by the Mishnah's editor. So let's just quickly review Flato's fully contextualized investigation of this little dictum. The core meaning of the Mishnah's teaching is that a king may neither judge nor be judged. Fine. Now the Mishnah's own examples, and if you have the source open, text 4, Mishnah Sanhedrin, chapter 2, you'll see that the Mishnah's own examples as it goes through in the subsequent paragraphs refer to Davidic kings. So there's no reason to suppose, as the Talmud does, that the Mishnah's separation of the king from the judiciary is an exception that applies only to non-Davidic kings. All of its examples involve David and Davidic kings. Passages from the contemporaneous Midrash and also from the Jerusalem Talmud confirm this general rule and even explain it. The king, they say, is granted sovereign immunity because he's subject only to God's jurisdiction. Now, Flato points out that the exclusion of the king from the judiciary is not necessarily the sign of a king's superior role. It's the sign of his distinctive role, a role which requires independence from the judiciary. But the corollary to the king's sovereign immunity not being judged, or we might say the trade-off for it, or the price for it, is that the king also cannot judge. In other words, there can be no possibility of the king's banking on his sovereign immunity to employ the law and the power of the courts to pursue his own personal and political ends. So is the Mishnah's separation of powers typical of the tradition? Flato notes that the model of kingship that prevailed not only in the broader ancient Near East, but also throughout the Bible, empowers the king with full judicial and legislative power. On this model of absolute kingship, the king was central to a judicial system and possibly even the highest judicial authority in the land. But a remarkably different and anomalous model appears in Deuteronomy 17. Now I'll share my screen again, but this is source 2 for those of you who are looking at the sources. And it's known as the law of the king. This very well-known passage is hardly a full-throated endorsement of absolute kingship. Indeed, establishing a king appears to be optional. I'm going to just focus on the bold-faced sections. If, when you enter the land, you decide, I will set a king over me, then this is how you do it, but it's optional. And in the bolded sections, we see the passage admonishes the king against having too many wives, amassing silver and gold to excess, but also it concludes that he must have a copy of this teaching of the Torah written for him by the priests. He must let it remain with him. He must read in it all his life, and he must observe faithfully every word of it. But notice that the one thing he does not do is judge anyone according to it. Why? Well, the verses immediately prior to these verses, so this is Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 to 20, but the section immediately prior to this makes it clear that the king is not, in fact, the supreme judicial and legal authority. Verses 8 through 13. If a case is too baffling for you to decide, whatever it is, homicide, civil law, assault, matters of dispute in the courts, go to the place that the Lord your God has chosen and appear before the Levitical priests or the magistrate in charge at the time and present your problem. So this passage establishes an independent judiciary consisting of religious and legal authorities, the priests and the magistrate. And it's only after laying out the supreme power of an independent judiciary that Deuteronomy 17 then goes on to describe the entirely optional office of the king. So while the king certainly commands a high measure of honor and respect, he clearly is subservient to the Torah, a copy of which is written for him by the Levitical priests, suggesting his subordination to them, and his subordination to the judicial authorities who interpret and adjudicate that law. In short, Plato says, the biblical legacy on kingship is bivocal, it's multivocal. According to the dominant view that we see in Chronicles and lots of biblical stories, the king is the ultimate legal and judicial authority. But according to a distinctly minority view here in Deuteronomy 17, an independent judiciary holds ultimate legal and judicial authority, subordinating even the king. What happens to these two voices of the tradition in the post-biblical period? Well, the minority view separates the executive and the judiciary. The minority view that separates the executive and the judiciary is amplified in the Mishnah, as we've seen in that little dictum, the king neither judges nor is judged, they're separate. But this, but it's also adapted even as it is adopted, as a review of its larger context will reveal. So the tractate in which that little dictum from the Mishnah appears opens with a detailed discussion of the judicial system. So you're going to want to be looking at source 3 now. Chapter 1 of the Tractate Sanhedrin lists cases that are heard by courts of 3 judges, 7 judges, 23 judges, and then here, the text I have on the screen in chapter 1, when we get to Mishnah 5, we see that it details the powers and responsibilities of the Sanhedrin, or the highest court of 71. The Sanhedrin handles the weightiest cases, and those are bolded here. The judgment of an entire tribe that is transgressed, a false prophet, the high priest himself. The Sanhedrin, the highest court of 71, decides on voluntary wars or wars of choice. It determines the sacred precincts. It appoints the lower courts of 23, and it judges or designates a city that's condemned for idolatry. So like Deuteronomy 17, Tractate Sanhedrin chapter 1 starts by presenting the independent judiciary that stands at the top of the administrative hierarchy. So chapter 2 then goes on to describe the 2 offices that are subordinate to the judiciary, and these are the high priest and the king. But their respective relationships to the judiciary are different. I've placed them in parallel here, but this is source 4 now, chapter 2 of Tractate Sanhedrin. So 2:1, which is on the left of your screen, concerns the priest and emphasizes the priest's subordination to the judiciary. It says the high priest can judge and be judged. He can testify and others can testify against him. It continues that he's subject to the laws of chalitza, levirate marriage, and mourning rituals, although in a manner consistent with the additional marriage and purity restrictions that attach to his role. The subsequent paragraphs from 2 to 5 on the right column of the screen, they concern the king. And like Deuteronomy 17, the Mishnah asserts the separation of the judiciary and executive, but unlike the high priest, the king can neither judge nor be judged. He cannot testify, and others cannot testify against him. Where Deuteronomy 17 subordinated the king to the independent judiciary, however, this Mishnah in the continuation seems to enhance the king's status by emphasizing his unique powers and privileges. The enhanced status of the king is expressed by comparing him with the high priest. Unlike the high priest on the left there, the king on the right is completely exempt from the laws of levirate marriage. And if we continue to the 4th paragraph in this Mishnah, so I've put that on the screen now, we see that the Mishnah amplifies the king's status in even more by giving him additional executive powers, such as the right to eminent domain. He may break through the boldface text there. He may break through the private domain of any man to make himself a road. and none may protest him. The king's road has no limit. He can also lay claim to the spoils of war before anyone else. The bold-faced text, whatsoever the people take in plunder, they must place before him, and he may take first. The only limitation on his power appears in the very first line. He may send forth the people to a battle waged of free choice, but only by the decision of the Sanhedrin, the Court of 71. So Plato notes that the Mishnah, I've put this text on the screen, the Mishnah strips the king of judicial authority, which it instead assigns to the judiciary and the high priest. But at the same time, the Mishnah affirms the king's leading executive role and buffers him from judicial intervention. The approach of the Mishnah echoes Deuteronomy 17's assignment of judicial responsibility to parties other than the king, and so it cites Deuteronomy 17, even as it emerges as more pro-monarchic than this biblical foundation. That the Mishnah's stance is unique comes into even sharper focus when we notice that it has some internal contradictions. If we go back to Mishnah Sanhedrin 2:4, which is in your fourth source, we see, for example, that Mishnah 2:4 follows Deuteronomy in limiting the king's harem. So about halfway down, or a third of the way down, he may not have many wives, he may not have many horses, he may not amass silver and gold to excess. But then we read the admonitions concerning the Torah scroll. He must write a Torah scroll for himself. When he goes forth to battle, he shall take it with him. And when he returns, he shall bring it back with him. And when he sits in judgment, it shall be with him. As it says, let it remain with him and let him read it all his life. There are some key differences between Deuteronomy 17 and the Mishnah. Here, the king, rather than the Levitical priests, writes the Torah scroll for himself, signaling perhaps his emergence to greater independence. But where the king in Deuteronomy 17 only has and lets remain and reads and observes the laws of the Torah faithfully, here in Mishnah Sanhedrin 2:4, he also renders judgment by the laws of the Torah. Not only is this a complete subversion of Deuteronomy's separation of the executive and the judiciary, it's an explicit contradiction of the earlier Mishnah dictum that the king neither judges nor is judged. So suddenly we see that little dictum that is so frequently cited and which has borne the weight of so much commentary as a central text establishing the separation of the executive and the judiciary is much more contested than we might imagine. It's an island in a sea of absolute kingship. Just as Deuteronomy 17's separation of the executive and the judiciary was a minority view within the biblical corpus. It's even more evident that the Mishnah's claim of separating is unique when we compare the Mishnah to earlier teachings preserved in its companion volume, the Tosefta. And this is source 5 in your handout. As Plato notes, the Tosefta largely equates the high priest and the king. So it brings the king back into line and subordinates both of them to the law. I've put up the Tosefta's comparison between the high priest and the king. And you'll see that in the left column, it says that the high priest who transgressed a commandment is treated like an ordinary person in every respect. In the right column, it says of the king, exactly the same thing. And instead of differentiating the high priest and the king along status lines like the Mishnah did, the teachings of the Tosefta tend to equalize them. Both are exempt from the laws of levirate marriage. Moreover, the honor and respect that the Mishnah extended to the king is extended also to the high priest here in the Tosefta. If you look towards the bottom of the left-hand column, none may see him when he's naked or when his hair is being cut or when he's in the bathhouse, things that were said of the king in the Mishnah. So according to Plato, the Tosefta openly presents positive and negative aspects of the monarchy. It records opinions that undermine this institution and doesn't hesitate to criticize a problematic regime. The Mishnah, on the other hand, consistently maintains a positive slant towards the monarchy. And if we expand the context of our reading even further to include non-rabbinic writings of the Second Temple period, we see even more the Mishnah's highly unusual position, or that dictum's highly unusual position. Plato, who does that work, says, according to certain references in Josephus, the judicial authority is independent from the monarchy, assuming that there even is a monarch, and the monarch requires the approval of the judicial authority for various state actions, so he is subordinate. In Philo's writings, by contrast, the monarch, the leading political figure, stands in charge of the judiciary and is uniquely qualified to function as the superior judge for greater cases. Finally, according to the Temple Scroll, which is a work by sectarians living at Qumran, the king contributes to the judicial order, but mostly works alongside or even beneath the priests, the Levites, and the judges. So in contrast, the Mishnah, which also clearly operates against the backdrop of Deuteronomy 17 and its separation of powers, projects an entirely different scheme. Uniquely then, the Mishnah separates the judiciary from the executive, but without demoting the king, as Deuteronomy 17 or the Temple Scroll or the Josephus do. Instead, the Mishnah calls for a strong and independent monarch without constriction by the judicial body. Why does the Mishnah move in this remarkable direction when other rabbinic texts and non-rabbinic texts of the time express such a different vision? Well, here Plato considers the historical context. The rabbis, he argues, were inspired to draw a sweeping separation between the spheres of politics and law, given their situation in early 3rd century Roman Palestine and in the aftermath of 2 failed Jewish revolts. Stripped of political authority, the rabbis dedicated their efforts to the development of legal authority and whatever limited judicial capacity they could carve out. Plato writes, reflecting on power from their distinctive perspective, the rabbis advocated separating between the realms of politics and law. Even their vision of the ideal Jewish leadership scheme, recorded in the Mishnah, therefore, included a partition between the institutions of the monarchy and the judiciary. Well, to this point, our discussion has revolved around that little dictum in the Mishnah and the various contexts that shed light on its significance, its uniqueness, its remarkable inventiveness. But we might just as easily have focused on the Talmud and its attempt to make the separation of powers the exception rather than the rule. Now, the authors of the Talmud, too, were politically disempowered. So why did they choose a different path from the Mishnah? It's often supposed that the Talmud could promote the integration of the judiciary and the executive because it was guided by a faith in an ideal Davidic king who was spiritually and politically virtuous. But is that, in fact, the Talmud's view? In the same tractate of Talmud, we find a series of subtle but very harsh critiques of David's supposed piety. These are pretty sarcastic texts. So in source number 7, you'll see, this is from the Babylonian Talmud, Tractates and Hedges, the same tractate, a little bit earlier, pages 3b and 4a. Now here we read, I focus on the bolded text, that as soon as midnight arrived, David arose immediately and studied the Torah till the break of dawn. So this is a seemingly pious deed. But it turns out he's overly focused on his studies, and so he neglects his royal duties. And when the wise men appeal to him, saying in the bold-faced words there, Israel, your people require sustenance, he callously replies, let them go out and make a living one from the other. And the wise men say to him, essentially, that the people cannot squeeze water from a stone. And David tells them to then go out in troops and attack the enemy for plunder, leaving his wise men to turn elsewhere for counsel. This Talmudic passage, the earlier Talmudic integration of judiciary and executive powers devolves into a royal neglect of power, causing suffering and leading to lawlessness and violence. And still, David protests his piety before God. In fact, according to the Talmud, he protests a little too much. He boasts of how he occupies himself with the blood of women, determining what's menstrual blood and what's not, a statement that perhaps only serves to remind the reader of David's adulterous union with Bathsheba after she purified herself from her menstruation. The rabbis voice their doubts about David, and they ask, as we see in the bolded sections here, but how could David call himself pious as he does in a psalm? Well, in a clever bit of exegesis, they assert that actually David himself was uncertain of his piety, and he sought assurance from God about his eternal reward. David spoke before the Holy One, saying, I do not know whether I shall have a share in it, in the eternal reward or not. Rabbinic cynicism about David reaches a peak in a passage which I and other scholars really see as a parody. This is from the Babylonian Talmud, a different tractate, Tractate Pesachim 119, and this is source 8 for those of you looking at the handout. I'm going to begin a few lines down from the top. In the future, the Holy One, blessed be He, will make a great banquet for the righteous on the day of the rewarding of Isaac or Israel, right? On the day that He, God, rewards the seed of Isaac with His loving mercy. And after they have eaten and drunk, they will offer the cup of blessing. It was always an honor for the person it was a way to honor someone, to offer them the cup of blessing at the end of the meal. And they will offer the cup of blessing to our father Abraham, naturally, to recite the blessing. And they will say, bless, but he will say to them, I cannot recite the blessing because Ishmael issued from me. They will give it to Isaac, and he will say, oh, I cannot recite the blessing because Esau issued from me. They will give it to Yaakov, to Jacob, and he will say, I cannot recite the blessing because I married 2 sisters during both their lifetimes, which in the future, the Torah would prohibit to me, although it wasn't prohibited at the time. So they will say to Moses, take it and recite the blessing already. And he, Moses, will say, I cannot recite the blessing. I did not merit to enter the land of Israel, either in life or in death. And they will say to Joshua, take it and recite the blessing. And he, Joshua, will say, I cannot recite the blessing because I was not privileged to have a son. And then they will say to David, take it and recite the blessing. And he, David, will say, I will recite the blessing. And it is fitting for me to recite the blessing. As it is said in the Psalms, I will lift up the cup of salvation and call upon the name of the Lord. At the conclusion of the eschatological feast, the righteous guests are asked in sequence to recite the blessing over the wine, beginning with Abraham and continuing through the patriarchs and Moses and Joshua. Each guest demurs, protesting some minor disqualification, often beyond their control, having an unworthy child or no male child at all. And even Moses, the great and devoted servant of God, feels unworthy to offer the blessing because for some reason he did not merit to enter the land. The absurdity of this outbreak of hyper-scrupulous introspection and self-deprecation on the part of Israel's greatest heroes is heightened when David, taking up the cup to bless, confidently declares that he is perfectly fit for the task. David, the adulterer, whose hands are stained with the blood of Uriah, David, the Machiavellian prince who saw to the destruction of the entire house of Saul and anyone who stood in his way to the throne, David rushes in where the righteous of Israel fear to tread. What can this farcical representation of history's grand finale signify but a rabbinic rejection of even the best king as inevitably blind to his own crimes and misdeeds, and of kingship as inexorably corrupting, even without a formal principle of sovereign immunity? The Talmud, after all, believes David judges and can be judged. The slide into absolute kingship is inevitable, no matter the king. And in the end, we are left with the impression that no institutional structure is an ironclad guarantee against the abuse of power, necessitating a posture of constant vigilance and frequent course correction. So we've seen what it means to analyze traditional sources with contemporary categories and questions in mind. And we've seen how it can be done, I hope, with a sensitivity to literary and historical context. But we haven't adequately addressed the questions of why we bother to look at traditional texts from a contemporary perspective and who should do it. Well, Plato suggests that Jewish texts offer a unique perspective on law and politics for 2 reasons. First, Jewish writings reflect important insights into law and politics from the vantage point of the disempowered. So Jewish writings are a salutary counterbalance to views that are articulated by the empowered. And precisely because Jewish legal and political writings were more theoretical than practical, they had more freedom to imagine and explore theories that may have been largely untenable to implement within the realities of society in late antiquity. So traditional Jewish texts aid our thinking by pushing us beyond the limits of the merely possible. Plato's historical review, after all, of non-rabbinic and rabbinic sources uncovered various imagined models of the relationship between the judiciary and the executive, separate and equal, but utterly independent, pursuing complementary goals, as in the Mishnah. Separate and equal, but checking one another's power, maybe in the Talmud. Separate but unequal, with one subordinated to the other in other parts of the Mishnah and in the Bible and in the Talmud too. The diversity in the sources also shows us, and this is a third reason, oops, sorry, that's not what I meant to have here. The diversity in the sources also shows us that ideas and institutions are neither inevitable nor teleologically coherent, but historically contingent. It's not always the best ideas that survive or the weakest that fade from view. And through acts of retrieval, we can identify the paths to our preferred destinations, as Plato says. But finally, I would like to suggest that we turn to traditional texts because they force us to think and to rethink, to never get too comfortable with where we have landed. What is most usable or useful about the tradition then is not necessarily any one idea, although ideas are clearly very important. What I think is most usable or useful about tradition is that its insistent contingency, historicization, dialectics, concretization forces us to consider our options, argue for our commitments, reckon with the outcomes, revise and begin again, just like a good chavruta, study partner. In other words, I see the tradition as a chavruta, that unique dialogue partner who is simultaneously opponent and collaborator toward a better result. I'm reminded of this passage from the Talmud, from Bava Metzia 49b. It's source 9 in your handout. And it reads like this. Reish Lakish died, and Rabbi Yochanan, who was his primary sparring partner, grieved for him greatly. The rabbis said, what can we do to restore his peace of mind? Let us get Rabbi Elazar ben Padat and place him before Rabbi Yochanan, for his traditions are ready, quick to hand. So they brought him and they seated him before Rabbi Yochanan. And for every issue that Rabbi Yochanan mentioned, Rabbi Elazar said, there's a teaching that supports you. And Rabbi Yochanan said to him, do I need this? When I made a statement, the son of Lakish, Reish Lakish, would object with 24 objections, and I would solve them with 24 solutions, and thus our tradition expanded. But you say there's a teaching that supports you? Don't I know that my statements are accurate? And he tore his clothes and he went crying at the gates, where are you, son of Lakish? And he could not be consoled. And the sages prayed for him, and he died. Rabbi Yochanan did not want or need anyone to tell him he was right. He already believed he was right. He wanted and needed someone to point out where he might be wrong, so that he could get to work, refining or revising, reinforcing or dismantling, moving ever forward, increasing the tradition, rather than hunkering down in an echo chamber of certainty. He needed a good opponent collaborator, as do we. And the tradition, I would suggest, contains many and can serve as such. Nancy Levine is a colleague of mine here at Yale, and she's currently exploring the idea of the opponent. And she believes that when our thinking is weak, our opponents, real or imagined, present or past, are weak. A more faithful and charitable construal of our opponent, whether a person, a text, a prevailing ideology, a canon, as a strong thinker, right? So a more faithful and charitable construal of our opponent as a strong thinker ensures the corresponding strength of our own thinking, while securing a more civil argumentative landscape, which we all desperately need. Now, some would dismiss traditional texts, confident that they are unworthy dialogue partners, but like Levine, I believe there's much to be said for adopting a principle of interpretive charity and non-egotistical disputation, for seeing behind every opponent a collaborator, for allowing the words and the actions and the intentions of our dialogue partners to be as strong as possible, to make them as strong as possible, even where they disagree with us, so that our own ideas might be correspondingly strong. Which leads us finally to the question of who. Who can participate in this labor of honestly and fairly construing the past as a chavruta in the project of responding to the needs of the contemporary moment? Well, in his review of the Jewish Political Tradition series, Alan Middleman notes that the commentators in the series, drafted by the project to contribute to the series, believe that they are participating in and advancing the tradition. But he says they do not, in fact, stand within the world of the texts. He declares them outsiders, observers, rather than participants in it. In Middleman's view, to stand within the tradition is not just to join the conversation through making reference to a common text, but to participate in the world of normative assumptions that permeate the tradition, which he then spells out. By means of this religious litmus test, reflecting Middleman's own metaphysical and theological beliefs, Middleman ensures that tradition is little more than an echo chamber filled with a single voice, his own, a fate that Rabbi Yochanan could not face. So who is equipped then to do this work? I submit that it is anyone with a passionate commitment to open, intellectually honest inquiry, anyone with a humble recognition that no one, including themselves, has an exclusive grasp of truth, and that consequently it is always possible and necessary to learn from alternative perspectives, however long past. Anyone faithful to the principle that the full array of voices in this undeniably complex tradition, not merely those with which one shares certain beliefs, should be understood in their full literary and historical context, not co-opted or colonized to validate later doctrines. These qualities take years to cultivate, and they are never fully perfected. They are not conferred by simple birthright. After all, the volume does not include the works of Freud or Marx or Durkheim, nor are they conferred by ascription to a set of metaphysical and theological doctrines. They are cultivated by aspiration, effort, and choice, an intellectual and affective choice to embrace the tradition as chavruta, opponent and collaborator in the labor of its and our ongoing evolution. Thank you so much for your attention. I know it's a long time to sit and listen, and I appreciate your patience, and there is plenty of time for some questions if you have any. I will, let's see, maybe I think you've spotlighted me, Michael, so I won't really be able to see people. So how would you like to do this? Have people wave or just unmute themselves or indicate through the chat? Okay, so I see.
Okay.
Raised hand. Oh, okay, good. Michelle, I see.
Hi.
Got it.
Thank you for your teaching. I have one observation and one question.
Mm-hmm.
My observation is that we Jews are really caught up in our brains and thinking all the time and arguing, and we value that, and we sort of forget about our bodies. And I think that last text that you brought up about Rabbi Yochanan, which I love it, you know, he's grieved, he rents his clothing, he's crying. And, you know, the rabbis sort of try to address his physical sadness and emotional sadness with brain stuff. And I'm thinking about the psychologist Resma Menachem from Minneapolis and all the studies he's been doing about body and how our anxiety and lots of different issues play out in our body, and that we Jews sort of forget about that. And so that's my observation. And my question is, I didn't understand when you talked about how the Tosefta makes the high priest and the king more equal to us, but the Mishnah puts them in different categories. I didn't understand how you talked about the context of why they would choose those different ways.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you so much for your observation. You know, I always think it's so funny that you're right. We think of the Jewish tradition and Jewish culture as being a culture of argumentation, which makes people think of it as highly intellectual and therefore rarefied. But the fact of the matter is, if you actually look at the content of what people are arguing about, they're arguing about pots and pans and what you can cook and what you can eat, and whether this blood is this kind of blood, and whether you can have intercourse now or later or for 24 hours before. So there's actually a lot of talk about bodies and materiality, unlike, for example, some modes of philosophical discourse, which really are entirely abstract. In fact, think that you can't reach truth if you talk about physical things. You have to talk about ideas or concepts and abstract forms like justice. And rabbis don't ever sit around. They never sit around in the Talmud and talk about abstract forms of justice. They always talk about what justice looks like in this situation, in this case, when this person does this thing. So it's very ironic because we tend to think of that. And to me, what that suggests is that there isn't this dichotomy of the intellectual and the bodily and the spiritual. And that's what I kind of love about the Rabbi Yochanan story, because he lost his intellectual sparring partner and it physically ailed him. And he was an indispensable and irreplaceable, like all human beings are unique. And there was no other human being you would think you would be able to replace someone who's just an intellectual partner. No, they had a special bond. And so there is a real personal and individual and bodily component. He suffers physically from the loss of this ability to argue about concrete things. So I think it's all kind of tied together, the intellectual, the bodily, the physical, the spiritual. So I would tend to think of it that way. I'm glad you asked the question about the Tosefta because I don't want to be unclear. So what the Tosefta does is they don't equate the high priest and the king to us. So I'm sorry if I said that. They see the judiciary at the top. And then below them are two offices, the high priest and the king, where the Mishnah makes them different from one another and gives the king all kinds of extra powers. He can take eminent domain and cut his path, and he gets the first spoils of war. So he has this really privileged executive position. He's much more interesting than the priest. You can't see him bathe, be naked, get his hair cut. None of those things are true for the priest in the Mishnah. In the Tosefta, they're equal to each other. So there's the judiciary at the top. We don't see all of these extra special powers of the king. And in fact, the king and the high priest are both said if they transgress, they're treated like an ordinary person. They're subject to judgment. That's what it means to be treated like an ordinary person. They're subject to judgment. They both are. And they both have a certain honor. You can't, see them naked or bathe. So that's why the Mishnah stands alone in every conceivable way. It separates the king, the executive, and the judiciary, which makes it look like Deuteronomy 17. But unlike Deuteronomy 17, which subordinated the king to the judiciary, the Levitical priests write the Torah for him. He reads it, he observes it. The Mishnah says, yeah, he's separate, but he's got all this extra power and all this extra authority. And the Talmud even recognizes how intimidating that can be when it tells the story of King Yanai. So we see so many different models that seem to me to be alive to and aware of the fact that you can't construct some kind of ironclad guaranteed institutional structure, which is why we can't fall asleep at the wheel. You can have the best laid plans on paper. It just takes an insolent king who refuses to stand before the court, right? It just takes, a king who neglects his royal duty and the people starve, right? And it falls apart. There isn't a final answer. There is only constant pursuit and constant counter corrections to abuses that are endemic to power. I hope that helps. I see a hand by Michael Belinsky.
Yeah, thank you. Again, referring to the Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish story, if I remember correctly, and I just tried to look it up on Safaria, but it wasn't coming through. If I remember correctly, unless there's a different version, it begins with Rabbi Yochanan insulting Reish Lakish. I mean, there's a violent. Right. I guess what I'm curious is in the model of the Chavruta you presented, this is really a violence. This is also a violent story. I don't want to say really. It's also a violent story. So there is a danger with Chavruta of really, turning into something transgressive, not something positive. So it just struck me. You took a nice reading of it, but you left that. I wonder why you chose to left that piece
Absolutely, out. Because there are fantastic analyses of the whole story of Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, which, as you say, is a very fraught one. It's fraught with sexual overtones as well as violent overtones. So there's some really good studies of this by Richard Kalman and so you're absolutely right. It is much more complicated. Again, reading text in context, right? And that's why you end up going down one rabbit hole after the other. Every text you cite deserves its own So you're absolutely right. But that is why I carefully chose my words to always say opponent and collaborator, because a chavruta does not err on the side of becoming too much of an opponent or too much of a collaborator. Rabbi Elazar ben Fadat is just a yes man, right? You don't want your chavruta to just be a yes man either. But you want them to be an opponent, but also a collaborator. And it's true that there were times in which the relationship between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan tipped in the other balance, became too much of the opponent, where they became personal attacks, right? So just before this, the insult, when Rabbi Yochanan insults him for his prior life of brigandage, because Reish Lakish was a gladiator for the Romans and so on. And so when Rabbi Yochanan gets upset, he reminds him of this and insults him. And then, this terrible thing happens and he realizes his loss. So it's a complicated story, of course, but if I were to do a full analysis, I would pursue that. What is that balance itself? Again, there's no relationship on paper that's ever an ironclad guarantee that people will not somehow err and get the balance wrong. And we have to constantly be alive to that. So the chavruta is the opponent collaborator, not too much of one or the other. Thanks. Dov Weinstock, I see your hand up.
Hello. Thank you for the very insightful and interesting talk. It leaves me a little bit frustrated, though, because while I certainly agree that the tradition really encouraged us to grapple with ideas, with its different poles, with our fellow studiers, fellow man, at the same time, if that's, and that's certainly a valuable lesson, but I feel like if that's what the tradition really offers, then maybe we don't really need the tradition. I mean, I could have reached that conclusion myself, that if one is too self-centered and only encounters ideas that one agrees with, like on Facebook, then maybe there's something wrong there. So I think one could generate this idea that you should seek out arguments and opposing views without the tradition.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it's undeniable that the tradition doesn't give you, answers, pat answers. It's undeniable that it gives you different paths to follow. And I feel like, whatever education in the tradition we've had tends to be with a bias, and we will ultimately most likely fall out on the side of our bias. And so the whole enterprise, is kind of fraught that way too. And so it leaves me feeling a little frustrated with, like, what's the answer to the original question? What's the point of the tradition?
So I wasn't trying to say that what the tradition tells us is that we should consider other points of view. That's something I have prior to the tradition. What I'm suggesting is those good practices that we have, those habits that we should develop, are ones that we can develop using the tradition as a partner. Once we can overcome, I think, the somewhat arrogant assumption we have that only modern and contemporary voices have anything to say. I have been astonished over and over again at the fact that I hear and see things in traditional texts that I do not hear and see in contemporary views. And one of the things that I think I hear repeatedly in the contemporary texts is, this I think is what we have to learn from them, perhaps in this particular setting, is what I just said before, the utter contingency of all of our plans. There is a very strong confidence among many, many people that we can actually design something that will be self-operating and self-monitoring and self-correcting. I see this in students all the time who really have this sort of faith that if we just somehow got the system right, we can inoculate the system from its abuse by human beings. But maybe that's not news to you, that's fine, but there could be some other topic that I could choose to talk about, where I'm quite convinced we would see something that we hadn't seen. What I find really fascinating about this too is that when I read these texts, I think I always had sort of a natural bias against the idea of sovereign immunity. Just strikes me right off the bat as wrong. And what reading these texts and studying these texts made me appreciate was sovereign immunity is not a bad thing as long as it's accompanied by an absolute guarantee that the person who's not judged also is totally unable to judge. So the judiciary is 100% independent. Because if you can't be judged and yet you can use the judiciary to pursue your political enemies, right? That is the worst possible of all. And that was fascinating to me to realize that I would actually entertain an idea that I had written off as completely impossible and inexcusable. I no longer think it's completely impossible. I think the conditions under which sovereign immunity might be acceptable are probably almost impossible to obtain in the real world, but by the same token, I think the integration of the executive and the judiciary in a way that keeps them accountable is also pretty hard to achieve. So I don't know. I mean, maybe I didn't explain it well enough, but I think that there's a lot more subtlety to these views. And sometimes we see, here's another interesting point, the fact that the idea of the separation of the executive and the judiciary occurs in Deuteronomy 17 and in the Mishnah, texts that are not part of a democratic tradition. These are things, and don't have democracy on their horizon. It's not a goal. These, in other words, this idea of the separation of the judiciary and the executive is not something that we require a democratic system for, and it's perhaps a little hubristic and arrogant of us to think that maybe we do. It's possible that they saw it as useful for other reasons, administrative efficiency, enabling the king to pursue a complementary set of duties. We just want him separate and not distracted. But it's not a guarantee that it has anything to do with democracy, and we would be wrong to think it is. So again, I do think that when we study these texts, we see more than I could present really in the short time I looked at those texts, all sorts of ways in which ideas are interconnected or not connected when we thought that they were, ways in which an idea that we think is just a false start or just a non-starter actually turns out to maybe have some potential if we think about it in a particular way. That's what I think a chavruta is. And so that's why I think it's important to turn traditional texts, because I don't think that the storehouse of wisdom is limited to our living partners and Facebook. I hope that helped. And Dennis Gora has a hand up.
You just answered my question. Thank you.
Okay, I'm glad. I don't see another hand up, but I can look in the chat. These are not questions, it doesn't look like. Oh, the rabbis have no kings and no high priests and are writing to themselves or to us. This is sent to me privately, which I appreciate. Nobody was expecting me necessarily to answer that, but absolutely. But this is, I think, one of the ways in which the text can be strong. Sometimes we limit ourselves if we only allow ourselves to speak with people whose thinking is limited by certain pragmatic realities. Sometimes the best thinking happens when we just say, you know what, let's not think about whether or not something's possible. Let's just think. Right? And that is one of the things that Plato said. That's what's great about rabbinic texts. First of all, they're written from the vantage point of the disempowered. That's got to be a salutary corrective. And they could afford the luxury of imagining these administrative schemes precisely because they weren't implementing them. And that too is an important perspective to have. We sell ourselves short if we don't allow ourselves to sometimes just take off the reins and think in these kinds of terms. So I would actually see that as an advantage, a virtue of these texts, and not a demerit. So Dennis, I'm going to assume that your hand is not still up. So if it is, you'll want to raise it, but otherwise, unless there are no more questions, I'm happy to say thank you so much for attending, and I hope you found it useful.